welcome to this session called Think Global, Act Local. I'm going to ask our speakers to each introduce themselves and give a little brief intro to their work and where they're coming from to this conversation today. Do you want to start first?
I'm first, so I start first.
Yeah.
So I'm first. I design experience through space. My latest projects include, one, I was leading the design of the museum, a new museum, the story based on the 13 boys that trapped in the cave, if everyone remembers. So I was leading that on the conceptual design, and then another latest project is around vertical farming intervention for unused space in the city.
Amazing, thank you.
Hi, I'm Maddie Kessler. I'm an architect, also trained as an engineer, and I curated the British Pavilion at the Venice Architecture Biennale last year with a project all about public space called the Garden of Privatize Delights. And I also do a lot of work with the National Infrastructure Commission, where I'm really interested in smart cities and the integration of technology with public space. So I suppose I'm coming at this discussion in terms of sort of public realm, public space and people, and how we can sort of interface them with technology.
Thank you.
Hello, I'm Adam. I'm the founder and creative director of FreeState. FreeState, we talk about ourselves as experienced master planners. And I spend all my time trying to not get distracted by the end product, to think about the understanding experience as the underlay, not the overlay, the first thing that we think about, and then that inspires everything that follows. And I've got a book coming out this week that I might tell you about, but it's called The Experience Book, and it's a thing of extraordinary conceit, trying to wrap its arms around the whole subject, which is bound to fail. But anyway, that's that.
Thank you so much. So this conversation is all about how the digital is impacting on the physical. And I wondered sort of about this idea of a borderless society. So we're already seeing borderless bank accounts, and obviously our whole remote work experience has led to a much more fluid situation where people can recruit across the world now, and as long as you're in the same time zone, everything should still work. But I wondered if we're moving towards this increasingly borderless society, what that might mean from a design perspective, and what implications that has for designers of these infrastructures. Does anyone want to kick off?
I can have a beginning at that. We were talking in the corridor before we came in a little about participation. And I think that there's this really great piece of writing which is called Arnheim's Ladder of Participation. And essentially it talks about how you warm people up, how we ensure that you don't just connect with people, you don't just, get them aware, you don't just build diversity, but you get people involved, you get them to participate. And I see technology as ever so good at getting us all the way, all our projects, people partner everything so well, they share information ever so well. But when it comes to actual participation, that often stops at that point. And that's why I think we really also need to be in the real world, meeting people, looking each other in the eyes, listening actively, and then sharing. Because that seems to be that last bit, that we can't get technology to do all of these things. We need to have it both digital and physical. As a beginning.
I think that's a great point, and there's a reason we're all here in the room today versus a sort of year or two ago when we probably would have all been on Zoom. And I think we are in this exciting moment now where we're trying to understand how we can use technology in ways that allow us to connect, but at the same time ensure we also have these physical connections of being able to accidentally bump into one another, being able to meet people you might otherwise not be able to meet. And I suppose I always think it's quite interesting with filter bubbles, for example, where you sort of have these bubbles around where you physically, both who you interact with, but even more so in the digital world, so on Twitter or Instagram, all the algorithms suddenly make it that everything you're seeing is people who think like you, and you start to think the whole world is thinking like you. Yeah. But in fact, it's really important we talk to people who don't think like us and have these kind of more open-minded discussions and bring people together from different backgrounds and worlds and industries. And I think there is a role for technology within that, but we're still sort of discovering how that works and how that can happen.
Yeah, I think I do agree, and I think when it's come to the digital platform, we think that we live in the borderless sort of world, But two things that I think it would determine how we design our future. First is the relationship of us and our phone. Let's go back to, internet and all things. That's first thing. And secondly, the post-pandemic way of living. Because currently we're figuring out how we actually want to live our life, right? If everyone in this room probably say hybrid is the only way, but are we actually sure about that? Because it's still an early day, right? We often jump into conclusion really quickly that this is going to be the way we want to live in the future, but we don't actually know. Offices, big corporations still work it out whether they want to get people back to work. But us as an individual, we say no, we still, love this flexibility. But how about in the next 5 years, if the data, because we know that, now all the big corporate, everyone collect our data and learn how we behave and how we make decisions on a certain thing. And how about if the data in the next 5 years actually say that, with the hybrid working, the productivity actually go down for 30%, and all the big corporate suddenly decide, actually we no longer going to allow that to happen anymore. What would you do then? Because for today, we already design the city, we're already thinking about the workspace for a certain way, because we believe that, maybe we have to lure people back in through the cultural things, like lots of different things that we start thinking about, the new infrastructure, the facility that we want to offer people, but it might change. So I think we should also be prepared to start, maybe think beyond what technology could lead us in the future. It might not be this way. When Instagram actually invented, I don't think that the founder would, imagine that it could create influencer. It could become like a marketing machine. I don't think everyone ever foresee that, but because today it's become like that. So we might change in the next 5 years, 10 years, we don't know.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a really good point. And as part of that, I also think we need to sort of reevaluate the metrics that we decide on how well everything is working. So on the one hand, with all this technology and being at your computer more at home, you can answer a million emails, but actually do all those emails need to be sent or answered to? Like, what's the quality of the communication and what's the purpose of it? And I think there's an aspect of time and needing to slow down with it all as well. And sort of, for me, that's like the pleasure actually of being back in person, because when you're actually making the effort to get somewhere physically, you've made a decision that you're much more invested in it than just listening to a Zoom lecture online in the background, and you'll probably get much more out of it. And it's much better to attend like one physical lecture than 10 online, for myself anyway. But I feel like that can be rolled out across kind of everything we're doing in our daily lives.
Yeah. And as we move towards this more globalized society, how do we hold on to kind of the idea of regional context and cultural authenticity? And I wanted to ask Maddie that, because obviously your Venice Pavilion had to say something about Britishness and something about how we're going to live in more networked societies.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good question. And so I don't know how familiar you all are with the Venice Biennale, but it's sort of the biggest international exhibition of architecture in the world, and every other year it happens. And there's an overarching question that's asked, and every country has a pavilion there that answers that question its own way. And so the question last year was, how will we live together? And in fact, that was posed in 2019, and it became even more relevant with the pandemic. And for us, we at the time in 2019 felt the most pressing problem, which I think still is a very pressing problem in the UK, is privatized public space. And so who actually owns the spaces we're using, and how do we ensure we open up our private land to be more publicly accessible, and what it really means to be publicly accessible as well, who can use these spaces. And in the pavilion, we sort of had 6 rooms within a pavilion. 4 took sort of physical privatised public spaces from the UK, so the pub, the high streets, the garden square, and a space for teenagers, looking at how there's no inner city for teenagers anymore. And then we had 2 ministry rooms looking at sort of legislation behind privatised public space. And one of those was the Ministry of Common Land, looking at bottom-up approaches to land ownership and use, where we also had the ladder of participation sort of on display. And the other was the the Ministry of Collective Data, which was looking at ownership of data, and who actually owns all this data when, you know, we sign up to things, our faces are being collected all over the city, and also what can we actually do with that data? So are there ways actually for it to be collectively owned and used in ways that sort of benefit society? Because especially with facial recognition technology, for example, it's not the technology that's inherently bad, but it's the way it's being used that is. And so we were looking at projects, for example, in Spain, there was a really interesting kind of protest when the Spanish government, they put in a new law that they didn't want anyone to be able to protest outside their parliament building. And so instead of going there physically, a holographic protest was created with all these holograms of the people who'd like to be protesting but couldn't legally protest. And you start to get these really interesting kind of relationships between how you can be physically present in one space and also another, and how we could start to use technology in these ways. But I suppose something that I also wanted to touch on that came out of the Biennale was we had this unexpected 2-year delay. And I think normally it's quite a sort of insular experience. You're just curating the pavilion that you're very kind of involved with and becomes your life. There's sort of an opening ceremony for a week where you might meet other people and learn about their projects, but that's about it. But because of this unexpected delay, the Korean pavilion, they set up this thing called the Curators Collective, where we meet on Zoom once every other week. And at first it was about sort of almost like a kind of therapy session where you just share the problems you were having with shipping or, you know, how the delay was impacting you. But slowly we began to learn more and more about each other's projects. And there were so many different overlaps between what we were exploring. The Peruvian pavilion, for example, he was exploring something all about children play space in the city and the railings up in Peru. The Austrian pavilion was sort of looking at digital public space. And through that, we then started these projects and conversations together. So one of them was a bench in Venice, which UAE Pavilion initiated, and we catalogued all the leftover materials that we had from all the different pavilions. And then they put it out for a competition for students around the world. And the winning 3 entries then got built around Venice as these 3 benches. And another one was the kind of midissage initiated by the Austrian Pavilion, which were all these conversations, panel discussions we'd have between the pavilions. And then we've just had, like, sort of 2 weeks ago in Tenerife, the Spanish Pavilion organised another conference, like a similar kind of conference, where we're now talking about the evolution of our ideas. And I think there's been something really special about how it was 100% digital technology that allowed these projects to happen, but they all end up being quite physical projects with a physical kind of relationship. Sorry, it's a very long, rambly answer.
That's okay. We did ask you specifically, so thank you. But I guess how do we... the idea of public space is how do we protect that? Because it's already being compromised in the physical world. We're noticing these kind of pedestrianised shopping areas which are being surveilled and, you know, privatisation of public space. So how do we then protect that in the digital realm as well, where it seems like even more likely to be encroached on by people who want to advertise to us or collect our data or sell to us or gather us there for their own means? What does the idea of public space mean going forward? Maybe, Adam, you can...
I think I think everybody's touched on it to some extent, that we have to be much more intentional about how we better think about public space and how we bring people together. Like, we can't leave it to investors or developers or architects or occupiers or landlords or community activists alone. We need to start thinking about how we can bring people together with a model that can inspire that kind of participation, you know, that can help with the rules of the game. And there are fantastic examples on the whole. Architects, and I am an architect, and they're good people, but they often, you know, it's that thing that if you've got a hammer, everything looks like a nail. If you're an architect, everything's going to look like a building or a bit of hard landscaping as an answer to your challenge. It's hard. Or if you're a spoon designer, you'll go, don't worry, we've got a bigger spoon. Or if you've got an app designer, don't worry, we could do an app for that. And so what I'd like to recommend is that we learn from something like the LA 1984 Olympics, right? The way that was put together is it had this incredibly clear purpose around collective good. Then it broke it down into identity and values, and then capabilities across people, program, and place. So there were capabilities about governance and about how you treat people. There were capabilities, the programmatic ones, about narrative and about how we're going to schedule things, but also how we're going to walk the walk and together. And there were things about place, and particularly about adaptive reuse. But because they had this bulletproof model, it allowed everybody there, and there were 800 people in 1979, and in 1984 they had 54,000 people working on it, all of them aligned with this one philosophy. So I think we need to learn from these extraordinary models of bringing people together, and then I think we can start to better protect our public space, because we're not competing. It's not Argent competing against Brookfield or King's Cross competing against Canada Water. All of us are competing against dark kitchens and losing our lives to Netflix. And that's what we've got to work out.
I love that.
And if I may add to that, I think, what Adam just said, it's so true. It's basically, you just need to strip back to the fundamental thing when it's come to, the public space, isn't it? Sometimes we either think too much about aesthetic of the place, but we forget about the social and economic aspect of it. It is beyond that. As an architect, you not just go in and just design something that you think, oh yeah, this is look great. Aesthetically, yeah, that's the local. You go to the Aldgate, you just think, okay, that's a bit of South Asian there. Let's just put it there because we design something in Aldgate or Bethnal Green. I just think, it's just the facade. It's beyond just the aesthetic, physical stuff that you see. It's other things that, yeah. And maybe one other things, local authorities start buying back the land.
So obviously I'm guilty as an architect, but I often get very frustrated that everyone thinks architects just design and build, because I think our skills can be used so much more broadly, and we're great communicators and other things, and that's a lot of what our project in Venice was about. But I think a lot of it is also about this longer term, more strategic thinking, and getting the conversation to be much more invested in how sort of these longer term visions towards a city which is much more equitable and fairer, because often I think, a developer or a client, they might have these very short-term strategic goals where they need to bring in a certain level of finance. But especially, I've been talking a lot on some infrastructure projects recently, looking at how a sort of an infrastructure project like a sewage treatment plant can also be an opportunity to create a park for the local community or the local area, and through sort of fairly simple design moves, actually, which don't end up costing much more in a project, you can really transform a piece of infrastructure to work for a community. And so how do you communicate that to the client that it's worth investing in? If you have a park that people can use, it will benefit their mental and physical health, which takes the strain off the NHS, and all these things are interlinked. And I do think a lot of the time we have very aligned visions and goals of how we'd like our city to be, whatever our backgrounds and where we're coming from, but somehow we're almost set up against each other from the very beginning. So how do we break that down and make sure we're kind of talking to each other in a much more collaborative way and respecting one another as well?
Yeah, I love this idea that we could plan a city like we plan an event. That I think there's a habit of designing, building cities like they're fixed, so they're going to reach a final point and never see them as evolving. And I just wondered how digital technology might help us with that. And I'm thinking particularly of digital twins, how we can simulate things in the digital realm before we apply them in the physical realm. And I think the reason why cities take much longer to make action happen in cities is because there's so much risk. You have to build something physically, but could digital planning in a digital realm help us make those decisions much quicker and test out different scenarios and help us reach something efficient, valuable, useful in a shorter time? Are there any technologies which you see kind of influencing our planning in that way?
I would say, just like you said before, now entering the Web3, and the blockchain is already there, metaverse is already there, technology is already there, available for you. And as you just said, I think, we could do things a lot cheaper, and use a lot less resources when it's come to especially the inception stage, conceptual design stage, because you can propose the scheme, to people, especially communities, that majority of people don't actually have design background. It's hard to visualize things, and especially try to put yourself, into that particular scheme. I mean, how could you imagine yourself, living in the place that you can't even visualize? I know that traditional way that we use either the 3D modelings or the actual model, it's one thing, it could help, but I think, with the metaverse and, with the even like the NFT stuff, it definitely could help people, use it as a tool and as a medium and get the community to actually get to experience that, and you be able to actually propose, scheme, make things a bit more fluid because it's a lot cheaper to do, and it's the circle of the design process is a lot quicker, in terms of the timeline. So I think hopefully going forward that could be something, that help us.
Yeah, I mean, I also think there's a huge opportunity for us to be learning more through the digital. So I feel like we collect a lot of data. There's so much data that's collected, it's almost overwhelming. And we don't really do anything with that data. Like no one actually I think not enough resource or energy is put into kind of analysing that data and taking it forward to really learn from our cities, learn what works, what doesn't work, learn from cities across the world what's working and what doesn't work and how we can solve those problems. I thought it was quite interesting a few years ago, City Mapper, they were collecting where everyone was going to in London to try and understand where a bus route might be missing because people couldn't get between two places. So they recognised, I think it was between Old Street and Angel, like a lot of people were trying to travel, and they put in like a City Mapper bus. And I feel like we could very easily be having more initiatives like this to understand where our public transport is failing, for example. And I also think it's interesting, so I don't know if you know Songdo in South Korea, it's like a smart city, and it was a smart city sort of built from scratch, and with all this technology integrated into it, but it wasn't really integrated very well into the planning and design of the city. And as a result, it just wasn't a very nice place to live. It was like 6-lane highways, high-rise buildings, sort of a planned park, but no kind of pockets of public realm or space to bump into each other. And as a result, not very many people wanted to live there, and not enough people lived there to actually activate all the smart technology. So all these systems existed to very swiftly be able to theoretically deal with all the rubbish and things like that, but they never could really function because not enough people were living there to create the critical mass or density. And I think that really shows us the importance of embedding design in everything we're doing, and also just making sure that we don't go so far off theoretically without sort of testing things on a smaller scale at the same time.
Yeah, there's so much there, isn't it? I mean, I sort of picking up on that point, I suppose, of the richness of the experience and the overlapping of types. I think one thing I've found recently, which I suppose is just asking the right questions, that too often the big data, the quantitative piece, happens first, and then we try and post-rationalize it. We've been doing a project in Leeds recently with Leeds City Council and Network Rail, and the first piece of work was all qualitative stuff, so lots of conversations, lots of meetings, lots of time on the ground, and anecdotally, people were talking about this north-south divide. As you come out of the station, everybody turns left into the city. Nobody turns right. That's the old industrial heartland. Also, they were saying that, of course, this station is just for passengers, so we need to really concentrate on that. There's 29 million of them. So we started to ask questions of the big data to find out who was using the station, what direction that they were going. And we found out that 65% of people using the station were not passengers, which blew Network Rail's mind. Because let's not sell them sweaty sandwiches. We could actually do community amenities. We could have a health centre. We could have a nursery. We could even have a school in the station. And so that happened because we asked the right questions, and then the big data proved the anecdotes. And now we're going to have a far richer experience where we're going to design with time because we know who's there, we know how they move around in the week, and we can start programming this place in a really rich way that will change over the week. And we can only do that because of the right questions and the big data bailing us out, and now the designers can throw themselves into a brief that's a really rich one.
Yeah, I think all through this afternoon we've been talking about data collection as if it's a bad thing. It's not necessarily a bad thing if it's used in the right way, used for all our benefits, and gives us these great insights. But I wondered, obviously data is building smart cities, but how does it apply to an ancient city like London, which is a kind of relying on creaking transport and is almost... how do you implement data and smart technologies into an existing city which already has its infrastructure and basically you have to apply these technologies into a live experiment almost? You can't stop the city to implement these things. You have to work within its living, breathing existence.
I mean, I have a view on that, which I suppose relates to the thing about learning from events. Particularly really big ones. So we've been working on a few airports recently, and I find airports really interesting in that, there's, you absolutely know where people begin and the middle and the end. It's always pretty clear. And you know often what language they speak, you know how long they spend there. And so airports have extraordinary operating systems, almost like experience dashboards. And on the whole, they're there to make sure that, obviously they get the planes moving on time. But you can use those same systems to think about how you better program the city. And so what I'd like to see is we start to use some of those systems to help us out in terms of how we can better activate the city, how we can not just build the set, but start to think about how we host these many different plays and stories. And this is the thing, I suppose, about designing with time. And so that, I think, would be enormously helpful if we did that. But at the moment, I see that doesn't happen, and we have lots and lots of organisations that are constantly tripping over one another. For instance, if we take Oxford Circus as an example, you've got Nike there, you've got Westminster Council, you've got the Crown Estate and the GLA. If they were all sitting here in this room, they'd ferociously agree on the importance of stepping forward and getting people to turn up on the high street. They're all doing their own research, they're all developing their own apps, none of them are speaking to one another. We need to better bring these characters together if we are going to better activate our cities and fight back against Netflix.
Yeah.
I like Netflix, but...
And I think also at the same time, I mentioned it earlier, that cities is evolving all the time, and we talk about, yes, okay, in terms of the London, it might be ancient city, but the actual property, the actual spaces, it changed its activities. Adam just mentioned about the high street, post-pandemic. Now we know that the way of living is slightly changed, it's slightly different. So how we even, do intervention or plan about activities for the certain property that it used to be, 2 years ago, might used to be a retail, but now it might not be. So I think the digital and the data would definitely, certainly could help, moving that, forward, especially with this more intervention, because I think city like London needs something like that, small intervention to help activate the space and just basically show people what the new opportunities could be, when it's come to changing, evolving like city and activities.
Yeah, I suppose it's working with the different scales at the same time, but also having a top-down and bottom-up approaches at the same time. So I also think there's a huge opportunity for apps, for example, like the Good Gym app. I don't know if you know it, but it basically, people can sign up to it who want to get more fit, and you can also sign up to it, for example, if you're an elderly person who'd like someone to visit you in the community, and they organise activities. So, for example, a community garden where everyone will run to the community garden together, spend an hour gardening, and then run to the next one, and it sort of becomes like a kind of a day-long gym session. But they also pair up people with an elderly person at home, for example, so you can run and get the newspaper to them in the morning or something. And so I think there are opportunities for apps to kind of combat sort of things like loneliness, fitness, but also actually how our city infrastructure sort of works from both a social perspective, but also a sort of transport perspective and everything. Yeah.
What's it called again? What was that?
Good Gym.
Oh, very good.
Adam, you just reminded me about Oxford Circus, that crossing changed, didn't it, to being able to walk right through the middle of the crossing. Yes. And for a long time you had to make your way around as a pedestrian. And Elephant and Castle roundabout also big change, went from being one way to two ways. And I remember hearing about both of those things and thinking, that's going to be madness. People are going to be getting run over. People are going to be getting into crashes, but they didn't.
Yeah.
And those were presumably like little piecemeal ways that data, we can continuously study how to improve the city by making these tiny little interventions and slowly improving our city.
Absolutely. I think it's all about that. And I think, we might learn a little from Silicon Valley here, that the idea of the beta permanent, testing something, test, learn, evaluate, evaluate, improve, test, constant this cycle. And I think that spirit of, we saw it in the pandemic, didn't we? 28-day event licenses, taking on parking spaces. It happened where I live. Took over the parking spaces, restaurants and bars who couldn't have people inside were all pushing outside. And I remember one day seeing 300 people in this little square in this village, and in the distance I could see it said on one of the walls, it said Market Square. And it was like, what? I had no idea. I thought that was a car park. And it's like, this is what we need to do, more tactical urbanism. And I can see, a lot of the greater states are beginning to get into that in London, but I hope we can start to pass the pen around a little bit more, because I think so much of where we began this conversation about participation, that I think that, for all of us to have a hand in how we make better cities and to be more beta permanent will be no bad thing.
Excellent. And first, before I throw the questions open, you mentioned 3D modelling and visualisation, and I wondered, like a while back when renderings got really, really good, architects suddenly got wary of using them because their clients were kind of expecting exactly what they saw. And the same with people, right? We're using visualisation as a tool to convince people that they're going to like a new space, or this new space is for them, somewhere where they belong. Is there a kind of danger we can never make exactly what the image promises? So do we need to be careful in adopting these digital technologies in managing people's expectations? Because what they promise, they're always filled with, it's always good weather, it's always, full of lots of diverse people, nobody looks sad in these images, they all look impossibly happy. How can we use those tools but also kind of present a reality of what this city is going to be like, or this new development?
I think it starts from the process, because if you think about it, we often, designer, architect, we often presenting something, the version of the project that we want to sell, right? Because we want it to be one bang and that's it, client buy it and then it's done. But I think if you work, especially in the city scale, and especially with the people, you have to kind of change that mindset a bit. I think, if we talk about the core design, but it might not be fully core design, but say, if we want to actually include those people within the conversation early on, you have to actually allow the design process to be a bit more fluid. Instead of, presenting something that kind of nearly complete, or, that's what it's going to be like. Try to play with, maybe present just the actual form, just the actual mass of things where it could be, not the completion of the picture that you want to pitch or to sell. And because, we say that this new technology actually allow us to maybe, propose 3, 4, 5 scheme even, because we want to put the option out there to get people to start imagine themselves and visualize how they actually use and participate in the space. So don't think about the detail, don't think about the final products, but think about the actual, core, fundamental design bits of the scheme. I don't know, whatever that might be. You do the master plan, you might have a few different schemes. How about this building, have 20 stories? Or how about, the one that more of the medium or, low rise? I don't know, But I just think it's just the mindset of the way you're presenting things. Don't think about the final products. Try to engage them, with the actual core of the design first. And I think that could, and I think that's when the technology could help so much, and you don't have to, think beyond just, the fundamental design.
Yeah, to leave some room for public imagination.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Well, I'm going to ask if anybody in the audience has a question for our panel now. Is there anything that anyone wants to put to our panel? Yeah, I think the microphone's coming to you. If you just hang on a sec.
Thank you for the...
Sorry, there's one here. You go ahead, the yellow jacket.
Thank you for the presentations. I really enjoyed it. I guess my question is about the fluidity of the designing process. It will be taking longer, costing perhaps more. Like if I were investors, like at some point, I do need some sort of return. So how do you actually trying to factor that if your investors say, I have, I don't know, 5 years of return period,
Yes.
and your design process with this kind of engagements going to take longer. So how do you balance the two? Thank you.
Sorry. Good question. I forgot I had a microphone. I think the way you land that is the great stakeholder brands around the world, you know, Patagonia is maybe the greatest of all of them, live or die by their daily, moment-by-moment relationship with their audience as participants, yeah? They need to think about the purchase funnel every day. How do we attract people? How do we involve them? How do we create a sense of belonging so that they'll come again and again and again and tell other people, right? So in that sense, whatever it is, whether it's a city, whether it's a building, whether it's a nightclub, it's got to be on all the time, constantly caring, right? So I think in that sense, the design process is never ending. We've got to be constantly designing because we're always on. So this thing we're saying about almost those little moments, it's like always meanwhile, yeah? It's always constantly changing. And I think in an ideal world, rather than it being a longer process, it's a never-ending process, which sounds like I'm being ridiculous. And in that sense, that circle of strategy, design, and action is always spinning because our audience is always changing. They're always losing interest, and we need to create other reasons to draw them back in again. So I'd say, yes, a longer process, not shorter, always on.
I'd also just add to that, I think a lot of it is, that Adam especially has been talking about, is about getting the brief right from the beginning and really investing the time in getting a brief right, because later on in the design process or later on in the construction process even, that's when changes cost more to happen. So if you set that brief right from the beginning, then the rest of the process ought to be kind of more efficient and work better. And with the National Infrastructure Commission's design group, we've done a lot of research as to why does design have such a bad name within the industry. Because essentially there's a huge perception that if you get designers on board a project, the project's more likely to overrun, it's more likely to go over budget. But in fact, there's so much evidence to the contrary on these large infrastructure projects. The earlier you get designers on board, the more likely the projects to run to time, to value, and also bring in extra value for all the design moves that have taken place. So I think a lot of it's also about shifting this perception of design being something that's just an add-on, that's like a tick box add-on that costs more and you can very easily value engineer out. It should be something that's really embedded and part of the process from the outset. And then as your developer who wants to, make ends meet on the project, actually having the designers in from the beginning ought to help that process.
I mean, I would like to say, well, to answer your question, so there already not the app, I think it's some sort of software that you can use to help with the feasibility study in terms of the modeling the scheme. And it's basically calculate all the floor areas and the investments like go against it basically. So through that particular software, they can calculate whether this scheme, how long it's going to take you, to make the return. So on that note, that there's already technology out there that would help, investor and developer. But on the other note, I would like to think that developer and investor kind of shift beyond just think just about the quick return. Investor already talk so much about ESG. I think, everyone hear about it in the past couple of years. You start actually thinking more of the long term, and I think with the climate change, everyone kind of, aware of that. And especially like post-pandemic, we know that, our society and people, like the way they want to live their life, everything is changing, ever changing. So I would like to think that investor would have a bit of the longer perspective and plan for the long term.
Yeah, I'm going to add one thing to that. It's really interesting that talking to investors now, we're starting to see, like, I met a guy the other day who runs the eBay family fund, responsible for many billions of dollars. And he's only going to now invest in adaptive reuse projects, so no new build will he invest in. And also he's only going to invest in projects where there's been an integrative briefing process, like these guys are saying. So it's not just briefing the architects or the designers. He wants the hardware and the software, the places and spaces, brand and identity, people and culture, tech and services, all working together, because it's going to be far more, it will allow able to optimize resources. And so I think once more investors start saying that, then I think a lot of good things are going to happen.
Thank you. I think there's time
Yes.
for one more question. Should we have someone else, because you asked one last time, sorry. Right at the top, there is someone with a question. Sorry.
Hi, thank you for the lecture. I was just wondering, I suppose, as we're seeing in London, the rising or just high-rise buildings everywhere, how do you create that community again? So, getting to know your neighbours, and even just on a wider scale, how do you, kind of bring that back a little bit? So it's not just on the internet, it's like local. Thank you.
Yeah, I guess how we don't lose those.
Such an
Good
important
values.
question, because increasingly our cities have just been designed to be more and more lonely spaces, and just because you're digitally connected to someone doesn't mean you actually get that feeling of community. There's nothing that can. I think is that asking me to shut up?
It's okay, yeah, 3 minutes.
I just very quickly say, if you're really interested in this topic, look up the Lend-Lease Loneliness Lab. They're doing a lot of work about this. A topic, and I think it's really important we design in mind for these places for people to accidentally meet each other and bump into one another. How do you accidentally get to know your neighbours? Everything's just become so efficient that we've lost those kind of inefficiencies, which are actually really important for our mental health.
Yeah. And I would add one thing is, when you decide the city or space or wherever, leave the gap for people, to fill in their own identity, or just basically leave the gap, and allow people to express themselves and whatever that might be within the space. Don't try to do everything that's well polished and complete, because nothing ever complete.
Yeah.
I'll quickly, planning. So Myers Place in Melbourne, right? In the morning, in Myers Place, all the cars, lorries come in and load in, right? There's a little cafe happens there, but the road's happening. Above it is a yoga center. Above that is a sort of collaborative workspace. And then as the day goes by, that becomes a university, and there's students moving through it. And as the day then goes by, the road closes, and the bar comes out onto the floor. And then as the day goes by, the stairs up to the roof opens up, and the bar happens there in the evening, right? They are planning in terms of time. They are planning with time, designing with time. The local government is saying one building isn't just for one thing, it's about a multitude of activities, and we're going to give you license to be able to program the shit out of it. And I think that's what we need more of in London. We're too much siloed and going, that's that. I don't want to see that anymore.
Okay. Thank you. I think we'll leave it there. Thank you so much to our panelists. It's been such a fun talk and really interesting subject. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.